All right, guys, so we're going to be looking from the side control. For this specific choking series, can be done in multiple areas, but definitely a staple of what we do here. And we're going to be looking at 5 different head and arm chokes, okay? We call this the Hydra series, being that, if you guys don't know, Hydra is a mythological creature with 5 heads. And if you cut one off, another one just grows back. So what we're doing here is chaining together these 5 chokes. And if one fails, it leads right into the next one, as long as you can maintain position and dominant grips, okay? So a real popular position we hit this from is when our opponent on bottom, Alex here, is bridging, shrimping, establishing an underhook with his top arm, right? So he winds up swimming this through, hugging around Dan's back. This is a super, super popular reaction we get in multiple areas, okay? So what Dan's gonna focus on doing is staying heavy on his whizzer, keeping his opponent on his back, and he's going to wind up wrapping up the neck and catching a good chunk of Alex's chin. A nice strong chin strap, okay? Or if your preference is to make a fist, but either way, we want to make sure we get a good chunk of that forearm square on the neck, okay? And Dan winds up grabbing that arm that's around the neck. He's going to wind up reaching right on through. I'll give you guys a little close-up here since it's hard to see underneath, but Dan wraps out the neck. He makes a fist. He reaches his hand right on through, cuts it, and now most of this pressure of the arm in guillotine, guys, is going to come from Dan's lat and rib cage area here, okay? So he's going to wind up switching his hip to the mat and laying all of that weight on the top of Alex's head. So he's getting side flexion in Alex's head, okay? Pulling up on the choke, so we have force in 2 directions, up with the arm, and then the rib cage pushing down, okay? As long as Alex stays on that hip, Dan's gonna have a pretty good chance of finishing that choke by stepping high up on the back with his top leg and just doing a little oblique crunch as he pulls that fist all the way up and through, okay? So let's hit that from the beginning. Now guys, if you're fairly new to jiu-jitsu, and this is going to be a little bit of a lengthy video because we are covering 5 chokes, I would mark this as one of your first ones. The guillotine is going to be open from all areas, super high percentage. So we're going to put this choke as first priority. Guillotine, arm in or arm out, right? So Alex winds up framing, shrimping, getting the underhook, super popular reaction. Dan winds up catching his neck as he turns in, right? But now he realizes maybe he's just a little too high up. He didn't get that rib cage pressure we were just talking about on your opponent's head. So he's gonna wind up falling all the way over Alex here, okay? So he still has Alex's head and arm, okay? His arm's up a little bit higher now that he's fallen off to the side, right? So what Dan wants to start to do is make sure that, 1, his arm is around his crease of his arm is around Alex's neck, right? And 2, he starts to address Alex's arm that's inside the choke. Okay, so he's gonna wind up stuffing that arm across the neck and keeping it there with the inside of his top thigh. Okay, so now that his leg is pushing Alex's arm across the neck, he has 2 hands that he can operate with and start cinching in the choke. Okay, so that same arm that was doing the guillotine is still working with the anaconda choke. And now that Dan has that arm isolated, he can work to figure 4 his hands, make sure Alex's head is a little bit shelved on top of his belly. He's gonna start to walk in, squeeze tight, and pull the choking elbow to the mat. Done, okay? Solid. Take it from the top, okay? So again, we're 2 out of 5 chokes in, so bear with us here. Again, guys, if any of this starts to go over our head, we'll take these chokes in priority here, okay? So first one being the head and arm guillotine. He gets a good bite over the neck, drops his rib cage pressure, starts the oblique crunch as he catches high on Alex's back, but maybe Alex is using that underhook to lift him a little bit too high, okay? If he starts to turn in, guys, this is a great way to just catch them or dump them back over with your butterfly hook and then start to work the anaconda choke that we just spoke about. So Dan stuffs the choking arm across with his palm. He's gonna keep it stuffed with the inside of his thigh so that he can occupy his hands with the figure 4, hip in, and squeeze for that choke here, okay? Now, let's keep a close eye on this here, guys, okay? Dan's figure 4 is actually just going to switch to the other side as he makes his way up to his knees. Okay, so he comes up to his knees, he feeds the opposite arm through, okay? Gets a good hold of Alex's head. He's using a gable grip here to make sure his head doesn't distance too far away from, Alex's head doesn't distance too far away from his chest. And that's gonna allow him to figure four his arms here and sprawl straight onto his opponent's head. Okay, so we went from the anaconda choke into the same exact choke, just with an opposite grip, which we call the darce choke, and we finish from the top instead. Okay, solid. Notice Dan used that little shift, that little rib cage pressure we were talking about with the arm in guillotine, the first choke that we did. Okay, so we'll cycle through. Now we're at 3 here. We got the head and arm guillotine. We have the anaconda choke in case that fails. And then if that fails, we come back up and switch the grip and we wind up in our darce choke. Okay, so he's in the anaconda, realizes the position's just a little off, right? He turns up to his knees, switches to the figure 4, right? Sprawl strong, right? Uses some of his body weight to crush his opponent's head. Again, so we have force in opposite directions, right? But for whatever reason, this isn't working out as well. Maybe this guy's just got a really, really tough neck. Or Alex understands where his head needs to be in relation to his defense. So maybe as Dan's starting to come up, Alex actually starts to drop his head back so Dan doesn't get the figure 4. There's a little bit too much slack there. He's starting to distance away, right? So let's just go to the gable grip, right? That gable grip is gonna allow you to tuck your friend's head right back into your waist again, okay? So we're going from the anaconda up to the darce. There's a little bit of slack in there. So Dan uses the gable grip to keep Alex's head nice and tight here, okay? Now we can get crazy with the details, guys. This is just a general overview of the Hydra series. If you guys have any more questions, make sure you come to me or Dan or any of your other instructors here at the school. But to finish this Japanese necktie that he's about to go for now, he's gonna keep this gable grip. He's gonna start to walk his hips towards Alex's hips. Let's go, yeah, right? Now, his right leg, his nearest leg to Alex's leg, is gonna wind up stepping over, and he's gonna get a good hook over his opponent's, the bend of his knee here. Yeah. Now, once he gets that foot over the top, guys, Dan's simply just going to drop his left rib cage right over the top of his opponent's head. So you see Alex's hips raised because he's getting folded in a ball here, right? We need to make sure Alex's hips don't escape outward. So that leg trap is really, really important, okay? Now, making sure that the head is wedged in the belly, okay? Dan's just gonna pull on that gable grip that he's got and hip thrust forward. Boom. You might get a little bit of a neck crank sensation in there as well, guys, okay? But as long as we keep that forearm flush with the carotid artery, we're gonna finish that nice and strong, okay? So now we're 4 chokes in. First, our opponent sits up. They expose their neck when they turn in, right? We catch it strong using the oblique crunch as we pull up on the fist, okay? We finish the head and arm guillotine. Dan doesn't feel like he gets a good bite. He winds up falling over, stuffing the arm across, keeping it stuffed with the inner thigh, and continuing to use the same choking arm as the first choke. He connects it to his opposite bicep, makes sure Alex's head is wedged in the belly, walks his hips as he squeezes his choking elbow to the mat. All right, for whatever reason, there was some slack in there. He couldn't get that strong. So he sits back up and he feeds the opposite arm through. So that bicep he was just grabbing should now be underneath his opponent's neck as he comes back up. So the grip is flip-flopped. Same choke, just done on the opposite side, okay? He gets Alex's arm still stuffed across the head. He sits reverse with the figure 4. And again, you could use the same finishing mechanics as the head and arm guillotine. He just does that a little oblique crunch there, pulls that choking elbow up to the ceiling, and he gets the tap. Alex realizes as Dan's trying to finagle his grip and settle into position, he's not having it. He knows that he's going for that darce choke. So he starts to distance his head back a little bit, right? And now he can't get the figure 4. You're kind of like reaching at your fingertips. Guys, if you're gonna finish the darce choke, you better make sure you get a whole chunk of that wrist right over your bicep. We don't want any fingertip grips or forearm grips there. So Dan switches to the gable grip to suck Alex's head back in. And he decides Alex has a really good defense for the darce, so he's not going to go for it a second time. He steps over the leg, the top leg. He drops his hips over Alex's head. Again, that's going to create the same wedge we just spoke about for the anaconda choke. So now he's got the leg trap, the head wedge, the forearm flush with the neck, and now he's just going to curl his heel, hip thrust in as he pulls on the grip. Go ahead, one more time. Boom, nice. Okay, so you guys see how Alex's hips are turning over? Okay, ideally, we'd rather not see this, but it does happen. So that's gonna lead us to the fifth choke. Alex winds up turtling completely. Dan loses that. No good. All right, so now we're on to our fifth choke. And we saved this one for last, guys, because it's not as high percentage as the rest, okay? Dan winds up keeping his gable grip that he just had for the Japanese necktie. So notice, guys, we're using the same grip multiple times through the choking series. We're using that figure 4 and we're using that gable grip. Okay, so as long as you guys can keep your hands connected, as I said, with that Hydra, you lose one, another one grows back, and you guys can just keep switching between those grips, okay? Now Alex is playing a little conservative. He turtled up. He didn't want none of those chokes, okay? So now this is where you're gonna experience a little bit more grip fighting. So we wanna make sure that grip is solid, where through underneath our friend's armpit here, out to the other side, right? So it's almost like you have like an overhook on your friend's arm, and then your wrist is gonna be flush on the carotid artery, just like the Japanese necktie, okay? Now, in order to get that folding pressure of our opponent's head, Dan is gonna wind up taking the back of his thigh, okay? And he's gonna align Alex's neck with his hamstring here, okay? So he's gonna pull Alex's head, and he's gonna tuck it nice and tight, okay? He winds up sitting to his hip, covering his back, right? And now, fall all the way to that left hip for me, Dan. There we go, okay? And we start to finish the choke there, all right? So we really need to make sure, guys, that there's no space from your opponent's neck to under your thigh, because as you fall and you create that space, that's when your friend's head is gonna pop out, right? It's like a traditional guillotine, right? If there's some space between your shoulder and your opponent's neck, boom, their head comes popping out, right? And we lose the position altogether. So let's make sure that that back of the neck is really wedged in there tight, okay? We're gonna run through it one more time, all 5 chokes, okay? In the order of head and arm guillotine, anaconda, darce, Japanese necktie, and Peruvian necktie. Again, guys, these chokes can be performed in multiple different areas, but catching it off this underhook in side control is one of the ideal spots, okay? Dan sits reverse, steps over the top, force in opposite direction with the oblique crunch, and finishes, okay? You guys have to build the sensitivity for some of that, but now Dan realizes he don't have the choke, so he falls over the top, okay? He stuffs the tricep. He covers it with his thigh. He figure 4s his arms, so now the head and the arm are all wedged in that pocket, so he can walk forward, squeeze his choking elbow to the mat, right? And there's the finish, okay? No good, not working out. So he makes his way to his knees. He switches that other arm in there, hits the figure 4, same choke, just done from the other side now, okay? Sits reverse, steps over the top, just like the head and arm choke, right? And finishes the guillotine there. Alex has realized he has to distance his head from the hips. So Dan switches to the gable grip. Okay, again, we're talking a lot here, guys. So those first 2 chokes, let's keep in priority. When you guys have invested some time, and when I say time, I mean like a month, 2 months, into really repping those moves and having some trouble with it, then you can start to spice it up a bit and add these extra chokes here. So Dan hits the gable grip. He steps over the nearest leg, drops his hips over the top of his opponent's head, over his head, not on his head, okay? And he gets those hips right underneath or right next to his opponent's ear, okay? Pulls the gable grip into the neck and hip thrusts to finish, okay? If your opponent's hip starts to turn over, right, there could be some issues there. So then we may have to come up into this turtle position. Okay, Dan, just bring your butt to the road for me real quick. Yeah, square up. Let's just take a look at this here, guys, okay? So Dan's gonna make sure that he starts to pull as he steps up here, okay? He's gonna wind up getting the back of Alex's neck here. He's gonna pull it up nice and tight, to his thigh, okay? Right? Now, he has to fold himself to this hip for the Peruvian, okay? So you may have to do like a little windshield wiper of that outside leg, drop to his hip, catch his back before he rolls over, right? And now it's a little extension of the legs and a pull on the grip. Done, okay? So right there, guys, we got 5 chokes without ever disconnecting your hands. Depending on your opponent's defense and positioning, we can switch between these 5. And again, keep in mind, guys, it is pretty advanced to try and take this all at once. So take it choke by choke by choke, okay? There's no reason why you should memorize all of these chokes within a 5, 6, even a year, month period, okay? So put some time in, do 1 choke at a time, and you guys will find as you keep repping it and your opponent's defenses get better and better, you can then look on to the next choke and the other options and see how these chokes connect and complement one another.